October 4th, 1940. 22:45 hours. A damp field outside Maidstone, Kent. The night sky still smelled of cordite and burning fuel. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 lay broken in the hedgerow, one wing crumpled against the earth, its black cross faintly visible under the flickering glow of nearby fires. A young Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Reiter, stumbled through the wreckage, one arm hanging limp, his flight jacket torn and slick with blood. The engine still hissed steam behind him, as though protesting its death. He could hear voices through the rain, English ones, calm, controlled. No shouts of rage, no gunfire, just the crunch of boots and the hiss of lanterns being uncovered. "Hands up, Jerry," one soldier said. Not a snarl, just a statement of procedure. Hans raised his arms slowly, the pain flaring across his shoulder. He expected to be struck, perhaps humiliated, the way German training films had shown captured pilots being dragged before jeering civilians. Instead, the British sergeant who approached looked almost bored. He motioned to the medics. "Get him patched up before he falls over." Hans blinked through the drizzle. You will interrogate me?" he asked in halting English. The sergeant gave a faint shrug. "Not my department. You get your questions soon enough. For now, we'll get you warm." The lorry ride through the dark countryside was silent, except for the rain tapping the canvas roof. Every bump sent pain through Hans's arm. Across from him sat another captured pilot, a boy barely 20, who clutched his helmet like a relic. Neither spoke. Both expected the same fate. Harsh interrogation, endless questioning, maybe even execution if rumors were true. When the vehicle finally stopped, they were led through double gates and into a well-lit compound. A sign on the wooden building read, "Royal Air Force, Special Duties Section." British officers waited inside, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions unreadable. Hans braced for the bright lamps, the shouting, the tricks. But there was nothing. Only a quiet desk, a chair, and an officer who simply said, "Name, rank, serial number." Hans gave them. The officer nodded, wrote them down, and then said calmly, "You'll be transferred shortly. Until then, you'll rest. Tea will arrive soon." Tea. Again that word. It seemed absurd after the crash, after war and fire. Yet here he was, a downed enemy pilot, being offered tea instead of torment. The absurdity gnawed at him. Surely it was only a prelude to something worse. As guards led him down the corridor toward a holding cell, he caught a sound faintly through the wall, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Morse code. Somewhere, someone was listening, not interrogating, not shouting, just listening. Hans didn't know it yet, but his voice and hundreds of others would soon be recorded by Britain's most secret listeners, in rooms where questions were never shouted, because silence revealed more than cruelty ever could.
Hans had been warned about British interrogators long before he ever took off from his airfield in Calais. In Luftwaffe briefings, they were described as cunning and ruthless, masters of psychological manipulation who would starve, humiliate, and deceive prisoners until they broke. Pilots were told that capture meant disgrace, that the British would twist words into confessions, that survival would require absolute silence or swift suicide. "Better to destroy yourself than betray the Reich," one officer had declared. "They will strip your mind bare." Yet inside the interrogation center in Buckinghamshire, Hans found none of that. No dark cells, no blows to the face, no barking dogs. Just quiet. Polished wooden floors,
a faint smell of tobacco, a clock ticking too loudly in the hallway. The guards spoke softly, professionally. They didn't sneer at him or gloat. When he hesitated to answer, they didn't raise their voices. They simply waited. He was led into a small interview room with a single lamp and a desk. A man in civilian clothes sat across from him, clean-shaven, middle-aged, calm. His accent was clipped and precise. "My name is Captain Stevens," he said. "You are not obliged to speak, but if you wish to talk, we shall listen." Hans braced himself. He had rehearsed his lines countless times. Name, rank, serial number. He said them. Stevens nodded, wrote them down, then smiled faintly. "Quite right," the Briton said. "That's all the law requires. You'll be treated well. Tea or coffee?" Hans didn't answer. He expected a trick, a hidden meaning. He waited for the threats, the shouted accusations. They never came. Instead, Stevens stood, poured tea into 2 cups, and left one beside Hans. When the door closed, Hans sat in the silence. He stared at the tea cooling on the table. The lamp hummed faintly. Beyond the wall, he could hear other voices, murmured conversations, footsteps passing. A routine, not a dungeon. The waiting was worse than shouting. The calmness unnerved him more than any violence could. Hours passed. Guards brought him a sandwich and cigarettes. They said nothing. He tried to ask where he was. The guard only replied, "Somewhere safe, sir." Sir. The title hit him harder than any blow would have. In Berlin, they had said British interrogations were brutal because the English were hypocrites, polite on the surface, cruel beneath. But here, Hans felt something different. Indifference. Professional curiosity. They did not hate him. They barely even seemed to care. That night, in his small cell, he lay awake listening to the ticking clock outside and realized that the enemy's silence was deliberate. Not absence of interrogation, but a form of it. Every sound he made, every whisper, every sigh could be heard. Every careless word might be recorded. It wasn't cruelty that frightened him now. It was precision. He had expected interrogation under bright lamps and shouting voices. Instead, the British were listening in silence, and that was far more dangerous. The place was called Trent Park, though its official title never appeared on any military map. To the outside world, it looked like a requisitioned country estate north of London. Manicured lawns, ivy climbing the walls, and a small lake glimmering through the mist. But behind the trimmed hedges and white fences, the British were running one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the war. Captured German officers, pilots, submariners, tank commanders, were brought here not for torture or interrogation, but for conversation. The strategy was subtle and revolutionary. Make prisoners comfortable, give them space to talk freely, and listen without interruption. Hidden inside the walls, ceilings, and even the trees outside were hundreds of tiny microphones. Every room was wired. Every courtyard bench, every dining table, every lavatory, all transmitted conversations to a nearby mansion where translators from MI-19 and the Royal Air Force eavesdropped through headphones recording reels of chatter. The project was known internally as the M Room, short for microphone room. Its officers, linguists, psychologists, and German émigrés who had fled Hitler's regime listened for details, new aircraft models, tactics, morale, secret weapons. What emerged from these recordings would become one of Britain's greatest silent victories. The brilliance of it lay in simplicity. Where other nations forced confessions, the British waited for them. When captured Luftwaffe pilots were treated politely, allowed to eat proper meals, and even take walks in the garden, they relaxed. Their guard dropped. They spoke as they had in officers' messes back home, proud, boastful, sometimes reckless. Hans Reiter was placed in a shared room with 4 other airmen. They were all officers, men who'd flown sorties over England and been shot down. After the first cautious hours, conversation returned. They compared kill counts, debated tactics, complained about food, speculated about new British aircraft. Hans joined in, forgetting his caution. He had no idea the ceiling above him was listening. The M-Room analysts were, by 1941, gathering critical intelligence from such casual chatter. They learned of the Luftwaffe's fuel shortages, radar countermeasures, even the existence of new weapons long before reconnaissance confirmed them. What began as hospitality was in truth the sharpest form of warfare: intelligence by civility. Officially, the prisoners were being held in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Unofficially, they were an open book. The numbers would later astonish historians. Over 10,000 German POWs were recorded in Britain's listening estates at Trent Park, Latimer House, and Wilton Park. More than 100,000 conversations were transcribed. Intelligence gained from them contributed to Allied victories in North Africa, the Atlantic, and later D-Day. And none of it came from torture or shouted questions under lamps. It came from the clink of teacups, the murmur of tired men speaking freely, unaware their every word was being captured on wax reels labeled Top Secret. Hans didn't yet know the scope of this invisible machinery. He only knew that the British seemed endlessly polite and endlessly silent. But that silence had a purpose, one sharper than any knife. By his second week at Trent Park, Hans Reiter's fear had softened into something stranger, suspicion mixed with disbelief. The British guards treated him with an odd civility. They called him sir, served meals on real china, and even encouraged the men to walk the gardens under watch. He had been issued clean clothes, allowed to shave, and permitted to read newspapers, albeit censored ones. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like an experiment. At dinner, the German officers sat together in long halls beneath chandeliers that still bore the marks of pre-war luxury. They talked. They complained about the food, argued about Goering, speculated about Britain's defenses. The air buzzed with pride and bravado, and, unknowingly, intelligence. England is finished, one captain bragged, slicing into his bread. Another month and London will burn. Another pilot laughed. They said that in July. Hans smiled faintly, but said nothing. He'd seen London from the air. It wasn't burning, it was enduring. Unseen above them, in the attic rooms of Trent Park, a row of British intelligence officers leaned over reel-to-reel recorders. Each man wore headphones, taking notes in silence. Every boast, every whispered complaint was translated and indexed. They learned how Luftwaffe morale faltered. They discovered what targets had failed, which commanders were incompetent, and how much faith the men still had in Hitler. Hans's voice joined the archive one night after too much beer. He spoke of radio codes, of his squadron's last sortie, of how the British radar had detected them far sooner than expected. The next morning, he didn't remember saying it, but by then, the analysts in the M-Room had already filed the transcript under Luftwaffe Detection Analysis, confirmed. He began to notice strange coincidences. A guard would ask a casual question about aircraft engines. Then, a week later, a different officer would bring up the same topic as if continuing the thought. One evening, Hans turned to his roommate. "Do you think they listen to us?" The man shrugged. "Let them. We speak nothing secret." But that was the trap. They spoke everything secret precisely because they thought it trivial. Letters arrived, censored, but allowed. Food improved. Guards smiled. The sense of surveillance faded behind the rhythm of daily life. Yet, somewhere deep inside, Hans began to feel the quiet weight of unseen eyes. The brilliance of the British system wasn't that it coerced, it seduced. By treating prisoners as guests, it made them forget the war even existed, and in that comfort, their tongues loosened more than any torture could have achieved. One evening, during a stroll near the ornamental pond, Hans paused to watch ducks cutting through the still water. A guard stood nearby, smoking. The pilot turned to him and asked softly, "Why do you treat us like this?" The guard exhaled, eyes on the fog. He said, "Because cruelty makes noise, and we prefer silence." Hans didn't fully grasp it then, but he would remember those words for the rest of his life. By December 1940, the system at Trent Park had reached quiet perfection. The British no longer needed to ask questions. The prisoners were supplying answers faster than any interrogation could. Every hallway, every fireplace, every oak-paneled room hummed with hidden microphones. The hum was faint, a barely perceptible vibration beneath the rhythm of ordinary life. At night, in a basement miles away, translators and intelligence officers from MI-19 and the RAF bent over headphones, their pencils scratching steadily as reels spun. They recorded everything: political gossip, military chatter, even jokes. Sometimes, in the midst of laughter, crucial secrets slipped through. It wasn't just Trent Park. Similar listening estates operated at Latimer House and Wilton Park, each tailored for different ranks. Enlisted men were placed in barracks, junior officers in shared dormitories, and senior staff in the grand rooms of country estates, where ego was bait enough to make them talk. The British discovered a simple truth: the higher the rank, the more a man needed to prove he was important, and important men talk. Hans Reiter often joined the others in their evening discussions. The war seemed distant now, reduced to memory and speculation. They debated strategy, morale, aircraft performance. One night, a fellow pilot, still proud of his service, described a new type of bomb the Luftwaffe was testing: radio-guided, capable of targeting ships with precision. He whispered it like a boast, and everyone leaned closer. Upstairs, the microphones caught every syllable. Within 48 hours, the transcript reached Bletchley Park, where analysts matched it with decoded Enigma intercepts. The information confirmed the existence of the Fritz X, one of Germany's earliest guided weapons, long before it was used in battle. That's what made Trent Park so useful. The prisoners thought they were relaxing. In reality, they were unraveling their own war machine. The British didn't stop at intelligence gathering. Psychologists tracked emotional patterns, charting how men's attitudes shifted once they realized they'd been treated decently. The polite captivity undermined Nazi indoctrination more effectively than propaganda leaflets ever could. Records later revealed that over 1,000 hours of conversations per week were logged during the height of operations. Out of those recordings came data that shaped entire campaigns. Convoy routes altered, radar systems refined, bombing strategies adjusted. And it all came from men like Hans, speaking freely over tea and cigarettes, unaware that history was taking notes. In January, Hans was moved to a smaller estate near Aylesbury. He was surprised to find the same atmosphere there: civility wrapped around precision. The guards remained calm, the food regular, the silence deliberate. He began to write letters home, permitted under the Geneva Convention. He wrote, "I am treated fairly. No one beats us. They listen, always listening, but never unkind." It was the truth, though he didn't know just how literally he was being heard. Spring 1941. The gardens of Trent Park were green again, Daffodils pushed through the soil near the wire fence, and the prisoners were allowed to walk beneath the bare trees for air. Hans Reiter stood among them, his hands in his pockets, staring toward the house. The place no longer looked like an enemy installation to him, more like a quiet estate that had forgotten the world was at war. By then, Hans had grown used to the rhythm. The measured voices of guards, the routine meals, the polite distance. He'd even begun to read English newspapers with curiosity rather than suspicion. The caricatures of Hitler made him uneasy, not because they were offensive, but because they were starting to make sense. Rumors spread among the prisoners. Someone had discovered wires in a ceiling lamp, another in a flower pot. The British denied everything, but the suspicion took hold. Hans began to notice how the guards never seemed surprised by what the prisoners discussed. Once, after a conversation about Messerschmitt tactics, a guard brought him a magazine article about Allied aircraft folded open to the exact page that countered his claim. That evening, Hans confronted one of the officers, a middle-aged man with reading glasses who had occasionally joined them for chess. "You are listening to us," Hans said. The man smiled faintly. "Would you stop talking if we were?" Hans hesitated. The truth was, no. Talking was survival now. It was the last thread connecting him to who he had been before the crash. "I have nothing left but words," he admitted. "Then perhaps words are the fairest weapons," the officer replied. From that day, Hans couldn't unhear the silence. It was alive, deliberate, patient. He understood, finally, that the British weren't trying to extract information. They were inviting it. Every gesture of civility, every cup of tea, every quiet conversation was part of the same design, to make men forget they were enemies. And it worked. The sharp lines of ideology that once defined his loyalty began to blur. The guards' restraint, their professionalism, their refusal to hate, it contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told him about decadent democracies. In the night, he thought of the speeches he had memorized in training, the ones about British cruelty, weakness, and moral decay. But here, in this silent house, he saw discipline without rage, authority without humiliation, and power exercised without cruelty. One evening, he overheard two guards opening the corridor. "If they were cruel to our lads, we'd want them treated well here, wouldn't we?" That simple sentence struck Hans harder than any interrogation could. The British treated their prisoners with decency, not because they were saints, but because they believed civilization demanded it. And for the first time, Hans began to see that belief itself was stronger than any weapon the Reich possessed. When he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized the silence around him was not emptiness. It was conscience, quiet, unshakable, and devastatingly effective. Summer 1945. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins, the cities reduced to ash, the Reich that once promised 1,000 years, gone in barely 12. At Trent Park, the remaining prisoners were informed they would soon be repatriated. Hans Reiter, now 27, packed the few belongings he'd been issued: a wool sweater, a small dictionary, a worn Bible, and a folded piece of paper, his British release certificate. He walked one last time through the gardens, where he had once stood under watch. The grass had grown high, and the sound of typewriters from the main house had fallen silent. What had once been a place of quiet manipulation now felt like something gentler, a place of revelation. When he was first captured, he had believed he would face cruelty, that the British would humiliate and starve him until he broke. Instead, they had dismantled him with patience. No beatings, no shouting, just silence, civility, and tea. And in that quiet, the ideology he had carried into the war began to crumble. He had seen British officers who treated prisoners with respect, even when they had every reason to hate them. He had been fed, sheltered, and allowed to write letters home when his own nation had executed prisoners without trial. That contrast haunted him. Years later, back in Munich, he would tell his son, "They won the war not because they were stronger, but because they remembered what civilization means. The English fought with discipline. Even in victory, they never forgot their humanity." Trent Park, Latimer House, and Wilton Park would remain secret for decades. Only in the 1990s did declassified documents reveal the full scale of Britain's silent war. Thousands of transcripts, hours of recordings, entire enemy strategies uncovered not by torture, but by listening. Historians would call it the triumph of intelligence through empathy. Hans lived long enough to read those accounts. He recognized his own words in the archives, his voice, his laughter, the details he had once let slip without care. He felt shame, yes, but also a strange gratitude. For it was through that system of quiet observation that he had been forced to confront who he really was. On the day of his repatriation, as the transport bus rumbled toward the coast, a British officer walked alongside, handing each man a small parcel, tea, biscuits, and a letter of thanks for cooperation. When Hans received his, he turned the packet in his hands, smiling faintly. "Tea again," he murmured. The sea wind smelled of salt and rain. The cliffs of Dover faded behind him as the ship turned toward a shattered homeland. He thought about the sound that had defined his captivity, the ticking of clocks, the rustle of papers, the stillness that had said everything. Years later, when asked what he remembered most about the British, Hans didn't mention the food or the guards, or even the secret microphones. He said only this: they listened. That was their weapon, and it was stronger than fear. The silence that once terrified him had, in the end, taught him something profound. That restraint is a form of strength, and that true civilization whispers when others shout. In that quiet victory of patience over violence, Britain proved that a nation could win not only wars, but the conscience of its enemies. They expected interrogation, but Britain listened in silence. Autumn 1952. 12 years had passed since Hans Reiter fell from the Kent sky, and yet the silence of Trent Park still echoed in his life. He had rebuilt himself in a quiet, methodical way, much like the country he once fought for. The new Germany was gray and cautious, its cities stitched together with cranes and prayer. Gone were the banners, the salutes, the marching songs. What replaced them was something far more fragile: humility. Hans worked as a civil aviation instructor in Hamburg. His students were young men, children during the war, who spoke little of politics and much of engines, airspeed, and weather. They didn't understand the weight he carried, nor the strange affection he held for his former captors. When he taught them about discipline in the cockpit, he often quoted a phrase he'd heard from a British sergeant at Trent Park. "Calm under pressure isn't weakness, it's control." That line had stayed with him, a moral compass forged not in victory, but in surrender. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore the seal of the British Embassy in Bonn. Inside was an invitation, a veterans exchange program between former British officers and German POWs who had been held in Britain, a gesture of reconciliation. Hans hesitated for days. He had tried to bury the memories, the crash, the capture, the silence. But part of him longed to see that strange civility again, to confirm it had been real. In March 1953, he stepped once more onto British soil. The ferry docked at Dover, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the same damp air he had known in captivity. Trent Park was no longer a military facility. The war had ended. The estate had returned to private hands. But when Hans arrived, accompanied by a small group of former prisoners and guards, the memories unfolded like ghosts. The lawns were overgrown, the walls fading, yet the shape of everything remained the same. Inside, the rooms were quiet as ever. The hidden microphones were gone, but the sense of listening lingered, a kind of invisible reverence for what had once taken place there. A British historian guided them through, explaining the declassified files, the listening devices, the coded transcripts. Hans listened without resentment. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of what had been achieved, not only militarily, but morally. When the group gathered for tea, fittingly, an elderly former Mi-19 officer raised his cup. To the men who spoke, and to the men who listened, we all served something greater than vengeance. Hans raised his cup too. The steam curled upward, thin and white, like the smoke that once marked his downfall. He realized then that the silence of Trent Park was not just a tactic of war. It had become a lesson for peace. That night, before returning to Germany, Hans wrote in his diary, "The British defeated us without breaking us. Their silence made us speak. Their decency made us doubt. Their patience made us remember. In their quiet, I learned what civilization truly means." As the train carried him through the sleeping English countryside, he watched the lights of distant villages blur into gold streaks against the glass. The rhythm of the wheels was steady, almost musical, like the tick of the clock in his old Trent Park cell. And somewhere between those rolling hills and the dark sea beyond, he felt an understanding settle deep within him. War is loud, but peace survives only in the quiet. The silence Britain once used to listen outlasted the war itself, not as a weapon, but as a memory of how decency endures when power chooses restraint.